This is True North Story, the original podcast series. Learn, love, listen, live. Are you ready to discover your True North Story? With your hosts, Tama Fulton and John Hudson Messerol.
Hi, Deborah. It's Tama Fulton with the True North Story podcast.
Hi, Tama.
This is John. Hey, how are you, Deborah?
Hi, John.
Hello.
It's such an honor to speak with you, Deborah. I just have been so intrigued by your bio and your life. My goodness, you have lived an adventure.
It does. I'm glad you think so. It doesn't sound very adventurous to me. But
I haven't lived overseas. I haven't written best-selling novels. I haven't created characters like yours. So I am super excited to hear more about you, Deborah, all of your amazing characters and mysteries, and I'm so excited about that.
Great.
Yeah, so Deborah, just to give you a little quick background, what Tam and I are trying to do with True North Story is create a journey for our audience through the journeys of our guests, and kind of life lessons or things that they've found that work or maybe don't work or comebacks or all kinds of good stuff that are part of who you are that helps you be successful at what you are most passionate about. We always talk about True North Story is basically four things. We want it to inspire, encourage, motivate, and offer hope through the journey of our eclectic roster of guests.
I love it. I'm a fan.
Awesome.
Super. Oh, I just wondered whether you were both mystery fans.
I am an absolute mystery fan, and I am also, if truth be told, also an Anglophile.
Oh boy.
I don't know why, but I just feel a pull towards the UK in my life. I wonder if you felt the same.
Absolutely. And I don't have any explanation for it either. I have joked over the years that maybe it started with Winnie the Pooh. As far back as that, my family has no English connections or Scottish connections that I know of. And I just have loved everything English as long as I can remember. We were talking about this on this group blog, mystery writer blog that I do the other day, and I realized that when I was 11 years old, the Beatles hit. So that might have had a little effect on the Anglophilia, too. That and Masterpiece Theater, which came into our market at about the same time, and I was just so hooked.
I watched Masterpiece Theater as well, and I read a book when I was young called The Little Princesses about the lives of Margaret and Elizabeth and their family, and that was intriguing to me.
Well, and I think, too, to answer your question a little bit more about coming across you and as a guest, Tam and I are big on storytelling. And narrative, marketing, and everything is starting to kind of jumping in now. Everything is storytelling. We like to talk with people who actually weave stories together. I just feel like that we can learn so much from authors like yourself. As a teacher of a content strategy course and a writer, and Tam is a writer as well, we can't get enough conversations with amazing writers like yourself.
Well, I am definitely what I would call an unlikely writer. I certainly didn't start out to be one and had no background and no training. And
where did this start for you? Was it more the connection to the UK, or was it more just an inner desire and passion to tell stories?
Well, it started with reading because I read voraciously from the time I was about 4 years old. My grandmother came to live with us when I was born, and she was widowed and had been a school teacher. And so my parents both worked, and she was my primary caretaker, and that's what we did. We also lived what was then in the country, so I was kind of an isolated and slightly socially awkward child, absolutely devoured books. And so I think it started with reading, and then the connection with Britain. And then when I was in my teens, I started writing poetry. I think I discovered that there was this magic thing that happened when you put words together in certain ways. And so I think the fascination with language maybe came first. I certainly didn't see myself as a storyteller. I grew up with my late uncle, who was a very famous Texas writer, journalist, novelist, historian, columnist, newspaper columnist. He was good friends with Jim Lair, and
wow.
And he was quite a character. And I grew up listening to my aunt and uncle say, nobody in their right minds would ever want to make a living as a writer. So, just didn't occur to me that that was something that I would actually set out to do. And I was not a good student. I had a very checkered educational experience, I guess you'd say. And I really liked talking to, like high school kids and junior high kids, and about that you don't have to be good at everything, that it's no indication of what you might be successful at later in life, because I certainly didn't look like a good prospect. And I have an older brother, almost 10 years older than I am, who was a math genius and scholarship to Rice University as soon as he graduated from high school. So I was kind of the black sheep of the family.
That's amazing. I mean, it kind of ties into the piece that Tam and I were talking about with encouragement for young people, certainly, but also to encourage them that, your current situation today may not be what it may ultimately end up doing down the road. And that's another thing we try and do with the podcast is let people hear from people who are doing things like you're doing in a way to encourage and say, you know what, maybe I could tell stories. Maybe I could be a writer and learn from your personal experience in some meaningful way. When did you start to feel like you wanted to maybe
dip your toes into the writing water, so to speak?
Thank you, Tama.
I actually ended up getting a degree in biology, although it took me a lot longer than it takes most people to graduate from college. I didn't go to England for the first time until I graduated from college. My parents took me as sort of a graduation gift, and we did the whole European tour thing, but we started out in England, and I flew into London and Heathrow Airport, and I remember just, as you were saying, Tama, I just looking out the window of the bus into London and just feeling this heart-wrenching sense of connection.
Yes.
It just was, I don't know. I don't know where it comes from. But we had a week. We did London and Oxford and the Cotswolds and Bath and Glastonbury, and I was just absolutely smitten. And we went back, and I worked in the family business and saved up money until I could go back to England about 9 months later, and just went by myself and traveled all over for a couple of months until I ran out of money. It is kind of a meandering story, but I came back to the States, and I ended up marrying my Scottish ex-husband and living in England and Scotland, and then coming back to the States, and I was terribly homesick for England.
Wow.
And we went on holiday one year when our daughter was small. We were in Yorkshire, and I saw a place that gave me an idea, and I thought, wouldn't that be a great place to set a British detective novel, which I loved, British detective novels. And I started thinking about it, and that's where, and up until that point, I don't think I had ever seriously considered writing a novel.
So when did you just start putting pen to paper and kind of coming up and carving out a story for yourself?
I did. I thought, well, I've got a setting, and if I have a setting, then I'm going to need a detective. And that was sort of, always said that Duncan kind of appeared full blown. And I knew stuff about him and his background and how he thought and approached things. And I thought it would be interesting to give him a female colleague, as it certainly turned out to be. And I basically sort of sat down and started deconstructing detective novels that I liked and trying to figure out, how they were put together and how you wrote dialogue and hooks and red herrings and chapter endings and
were there any hey Deborah, were there any specific influences that you want to share?
Yeah, I was of course I read all the Golden Age British mysteries and Agatha Christie and all those. That I was and I loved Dorothy Sayers, but I was very influenced, I think, by P.D. James, and somewhere in this process I actually heard her speak at the downtown Dallas library. And I didn't have enough nerve to talk to her, but when she talked about why she wrote detective novels, and I was just absolutely fascinated by that. And so I was very influenced, I think, by P.D. James and some by Colin Dexter, and I was a huge fan of Reginald Hill. I don't know if you're familiar with him.
I am not.
He sadly passed away, but he was just absolutely brilliant.
Well, and the reason I ask, Deborah, is because we're going to share all about your books and about Duncan Kincaid and Gemma James, who are your characters in the mystery novels, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, and of course your most recent book, Garden of Lamentations. But I like our audiences to kind of see the people that they like or the people that they read like you. What are some of your influences, so that they can check out other writers and other authors and be exposed to them as well? Because I think that's super helpful too.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Tell us a little bit about the creation of Gemma. I really like her.
Well, I said, Duncan kind of came first, which is strange in a way, I guess, that I just had this male character's voice inside my head. I don't know any other way to describe it. And then with Gemma, I really started out to try to make Gemma in some ways like me. Mm-hmm. I was frustrated with the fact that female detectives in crime fiction at the time seemed to not be burdened with a lot of responsibilities. We didn't see a lot of female detectives who were married or had kids, and particularly, as single mothers, as Gemma is a single mom in the beginning of the series. And I wanted to write about a woman who was really, who was ambitious and who was really good at her job and, wanted to get ahead, but at the same time dealing with being responsible for her 2-year-old son as a single mother. So that was part of it, and part of it I thought, well, if Duncan was more my kind of personality alter ego, then I wanted Gemma to be different. And so I started out to try to write her as being sort of more, forthcoming. Gemma is sort of a charge ahead person where
right.
Sometimes Duncan is a little more introspective and kind of sits back and assesses things beforehand. Gemma is kind of a more charge into things and has immediate opinions about things, which is sometimes a good thing and sometimes not, but it makes for a lot of fun complications.
And that brings up a really interesting point. So when you started creating the characters, because you talked about the location, you kind of saw the location and said this would make a great setting, and then you started creating the characters, what was the next process where you started telling the story or thinking it through, or what? Just share with us a little bit your process of creating a story, because I think for so many people that want to be writers or want to tell a story or want to write a novel, it's just so daunting. It's like, where do I even start?
As I said, I took novels, and I think part of this is the benefit of having had eventually a really good liberal arts education, but I took novels and sort of reversed outlined them, and to see if I could boil the plot down to the simplest parameters. Okay, this is what really happened, and this is what the reader thinks happened, and how do you put these two things together and get to the end of the story? So I did a lot of just really basic sort of logical, because I didn't think I was a storyteller, and I started to realize that storytelling was not all that difficult. A lot of it is learning to do what if, where you take any kind of scenario and say, well, what if this happened? And then if that happened, what if this happened? And then kind of how you build a plot.
Which is not, Deborah, unlike being in the lab and coming up with hypotheses And then
No, it's really not.
So I'm thinking that maybe your biology kind of played into creating a storyline anyway.
I think so. I think a lot of it was just kind of learning a logical way of thinking about things, and all those wonderful courses like, history of Western civilization.
Right.
Yeah, but they did what if. And the first book, not so much. Well, I started out with the what if, because the setting for the first book, which is called A Share in Death, is a country house in Yorkshire, but it's a timeshare. And I send Duncan there on sort of a busman's holiday, and somebody is murdered, and then he has to get to know all the people who are staying and figure out who might have had a motive. And so the second book has to do with supposed assisted suicide, and I had read something in the newspaper about a woman who had befriended a colleague at work, a younger woman, and had developed this relationship with her where she wanted the younger woman to help her commit suicide. And I just thought that was the most interesting situation. And again, it was a situation of what if. What would you do if somebody asked you to do something like that? And what would you do if you were the person who had asked that and then decided that you had changed your mind, and all the permutations? And so that was, kind of a part of the process of teaching myself to plot.
And just so that our audience knows, as you were referring to your first and second book, the book that came out in February of this year is number 17 of this.
That's right.
Right? So covering over 20 years, which is really amazing for this mystery series for Duncan and Gemma. People come back and people love, I don't know what it is. When we read books, it's almost like we jump into their world, and it's like Duncan and Gemma are friends of ours in some way, or that we know them, or that we get to observe them in meaningful ways. I want to back up here because this is the tricky part. So walk us through like the publishing part. Like, when did you know when the first book in 93 got published, A Share in Death? How did that whole thing work where like you wrote it, and walk us through that process of it to getting it published, because that's really amazing. And then 16 more books and other books and all the craziness that followed.
I certainly never started out thinking that I would be writing these books 23, 24 years later. And I should probably mention for listeners that Duncan and Gemma, they live in sort of fluid time. I decided with the very first book to handle series time the way P.D. James had done, so that, it would be lovely if I could go back and revise those early books and do a little technological update. For my characters, it's only been about 5 years, but every book is contemporary, like Garden of Lamentations. The new book is now. So you just have to be a little forgiving.
Right.
The way the story timeline fits. Well, on the getting published, I'm not even sure how long it took me to write that first book. I did lots of community college Saturday afternoon how to write a novel classes, and read lots of books on how to write a mystery novel. And I joined Mystery Writers of America, and I joined Sisters in Crime. I think I decided very early on that it was not only a passion, but it was something that needed to be approached very professionally. So I tried to take all the steps that you would take, and one of them is not only learning your craft, but making contacts and getting to know the business. And I had a wonderful writing teacher. I took a 17-week course from a writer named Warren Norwood, who has sadly passed away, but he was a brilliant teacher, and the course was called Writing Fiction for Fun and Profit. And I learned he was not only a science fiction author, but he had been a salesman for Ballantine Books, so he knew both sides of the business. And I think that was just hugely, hugely helpful. I mean, I learned how the business worked, and how submissions worked, and how to format a manuscript and write query letters and all that stuff that you need to know how to do. And when I finished that first book, and the Mystery Writers of America Southwest chapter was having a workshop, annual workshop in Houston, and where they bring in New York editors and agents. And so I had written the editor in, the correct format and said, would he be interested in seeing sample pages? And he wrote me back and said, actually on my query letter, and said, send complete manuscript. So I thought, 6 weeks later, I go to this conference in Houston, and I thought, oh, he will have read my manuscript, and he didn't even remember sending me the reply, much less who I was. But I got to meet him. You see, that's the thing about putting yourself out there to do these things, like go to conferences and meeting editors and meeting agents, because I got to meet him and I got to make a personal connection with him. And over about the next 6 months, I would call his editorial assistant every couple of weeks and ask her how far the manuscript had gotten up the pile. And she'd say, well, it's moving up there.
Another couple of weeks.
Yeah. And somewhere during this process, I went to another workshop. I met another editor from the same publishing house, which, by the way, was Avon. And he said, and I got to do my little pitch. By that time, I was working on the second book, and I had a series proposal, which, for the first 3 books. And this editor said, well, if the first editor wasn't interested, he would be interested, and did I have an agent? And I said no, because, it's catch-22. If you're not published, you can't get an agent, and if you don't have an agent, you can't get published.
Amen. That's the catch-22. It's the worst thing ever.
Yeah. So he gave me the name of a New York agent, and it took me about 2 weeks to get up the courage to call her, but I did. And in that time, the first editor read the manuscript and kicked it upstairs to William Morrow.
Wow.
Because he thought it should be published as hardcover, because Avon was...
That's huge.
Paperback original.
And for the record, just real quick, Deborah, for the record, that is your publisher. Your publisher is William Morrow.
Well, but it's the little twist of the story is that I didn't start out with William Morrow. And the agent that I called took me on. We've been together 25 years.
Oh, my goodness.
But we ended up selling the first 3 books not to William Morrow, but to Scribner, which was huge because they were then the most literary New York house of Hemingway and their wonderful history. So I did my first 5 books with Scribner, and then I moved to Bantam, Random House, and then I moved to William Morrow, and this is my 9th book with William Morrow. So I think it's a lovely little twist that I ended up...
back home, so to speak.
True North Stories. Meant to inspire, encourage, motivate, and offer hope. And now, back to the program.
We drove that car as far as we could, abandoned it out west. Split up on the docks at night, but agreeing it was best. And she turned around to look at me as I was walking away. I heard her say over my shoulder, we'll meet again someday on the avenue. Tangled up in blue.
Tell us a little bit about this latest book, Garden of Lamentations, Deborah. Where did you come up with the plot line for this book, and where were you thinking that things would go?
Oh, it's kind of a complicated book, and I'm not a very fast writer. I would like to say that I'd written, 24 books in 24 years, but I haven't. Obviously, I haven't managed that.
Well, you've done pretty well.
My publisher would like it to be 24.
Oh, my, okay.
Yeah. I always write faster. But I came up with an idea 3 or 4 books back of something that I had written that just bugged me because I knew that something that had something that happened in the resolution of that book, which is called No Mark Upon Her, was not what it appeared to be. And this is not a spoiler for that book because it doesn't affect, the solution to the murder in that book. But it was just something, and I kept thinking about it, and I knew it was a story I had to tell. And it has to do with the background of Duncan's boss, who's been his boss since the very first book. His name is Dennis Childs, and stuff that was going on in the Metropolitan Police. And so that story kind of goes underground for a couple of books and then comes back in this one. And in the meantime, I had become, with the book before Garden of Lamentations, which is called To Dwell in Darkness, I had become fascinated with learning about British undercover police officers who had worked for Special Branch. And this started out back in the 60s, and they did all kinds of things that, like real spies and without any oversight.
Kind of like James
really
Bondish.
Covert, kind of?
Yeah, they did long-term undercover operations, 3 or 4 years, and, they did the whole dead baby false identity thing, and
Wow.
created very elaborate cover stories, and they were put by Special Branch, which is, part of the Metropolitan Police, into activist groups, and groups that had not necessarily done anything illegal, but that might pose a threat to order. So some of these groups were right-wing and some of them were left-wing. And I was fascinated by the whole idea and thinking about, and again, this comes back to the sort of what-if plotting. And I thought, well, what if you were one of these officers that was sent on this long-term undercover assignment and you became sympathetic with the agenda of the group that you were sent to spy on?
Oh, my. Yeah, a little Stockholm syndrome going on.
Yeah, and then what would happen, and you also came to think that what the government was asking you to do was not right. So that's kind of the background of part of the story in Garden of Lamentations is what happens in that situation. And Duncan is dealing with worrying about his boss and worrying about corruption that is going on within the police force and how to deal with that. And Gemma is investigating a different case where a young woman who's a nanny is found murdered in a very private, exclusive Notting Hill garden. And so everybody is kind of at cross purposes in this book. It was challenging.
I love the way that you write the opening of the woman, and I don't want to give too much away, but that is found murdered. But where does that come from? Like to be able to put your head into the or your writing in your head into the head of a young woman and what she's feeling and how she's talking to herself in her own head as this is playing out in the beginning of the book. Do you do any preparation, or is that just from experience to make that totally believable,
Well, the interesting thing about the opening scene of Garden of Lamentations is that it was the last thing I wrote. The original opening scene is what is now the second scene, which is the discovery of the body of the young woman in the garden. And when my I have a wonderful editor at Morrow, and when she read it, she said, I think, we just need something at the beginning that gives a little more sense of impending doom. And at that point, I knew exactly what it was because I knew the character. I knew what happened that night. I knew what she was thinking, and then and all the ramifications of it. And so I sat down and wrote that scene in about an hour.
Wow. Well, it is a great launching point. Because it just you're vested in the beginning. You want to know what happens, and it's just amazing.
We got a very smart editor.
Yeah, well, that is so true. They always say a writer's only as good as their editor. I'm not sure about all of that. I think there's a lot of talent on the writing side, but boy, there's talent on the editing side too.
I don't know. But I think a good editor makes a huge difference, and I think mine is brilliant. I mean, she's just so good at knowing what you can leave out to keep the story tension moving, and I think it's a real talent that writers who don't like to be edited are doing themselves a disservice.
Well, Deborah, obviously something has gone really well because not only has your editor done his or her job, but you have become a New York Times best-selling author. I wanted just to ask about those accolades and how that happened for you, and did that motivate you to just keep writing?
Oh, I've always been motivated to keep writing. My Scottish ex-husband asked me when I had finished the first book and was trying to sell it what I was going to do if I didn't sell it.
That's kind of a discouraging question.
Yes, and I said, I'm going to write another one.
Well, there you go.
You know.
But what was it like to hear that your book had the New York Times best-selling list? More than one book.
Oh, yeah. Well, the Sound of Broken Glass, which is not the book before Garden of Lamentations, but the book before that, I think debuted at number 9 on the New York Times list. And the thing about when this happens, when you're an author and you're on book tour and you find this stuff out, you're usually in a hotel room by yourself because you're on tour. And so I think I had like a little half bottle of champagne set up from room service
to celebrate.
And I saved, because you have to do something, and I saved the cork. It's in my. I keep it in my travel bag as sort of a good luck.
Oh, that's awesome. Tama and I, we love mementos, and we love little things that celebrate the moment, and just something that reminds you of that, because I think that's part of living. It's not being egotistical or over the top. It's just celebrating little victories.
Exactly. And every time I dig in my carry-on bag for something, I'll find that cork in the bottom and think, oh.
Exactly.
My cork. My top 10
Number 9.
Cork.
Exactly.
Just a big believer in celebrating all kinds of little successes and milestones.
Absolutely. How is it like when you're on the book tour and you're meeting your audience and your fans, and they're so vested in these characters and in your writing, and when's the next book coming out and what's going to happen, and what is that like for you, the writer, to meet those people and to interact with them?
It's amazing. I love doing it. I was on the road for a month.
Wow.
With Garden of Lamentations and kind of crisscrossing the country. I was in Seattle. It was a crazy schedule, but I just love it. I mean, to meet people who say, I've read your books from the very first book, and the characters feel to them like family. It's very moving, and it's very inspiring, and it's a good incentive to come home and get back to work and write the next book, because there are people out there who want to know what happens. And the way my series works is that, it's kind of slice of life where you kind of drop in on Duncan and Gemma, and, you have this sort of high pressure, intense investigation, and then, and then you pop out again. And so for me too, I want to drop back into their lives and see what they're doing and how they're doing. And of course, a big part of it for me is I want to be in England.
Have you been over to visit any of the places where you've set your stories?
I go every year, usually at least once and sometimes twice. I was there for 2 months total last year in 2016. So everywhere my stories have been set, I have been, and I've done all kinds of fun research. And one of the fun things, Tammy, you may appreciate that has happened over the course of the series is that when I started the series, I didn't know London all that well, because I decided I hadn't lived in London. I'd lived in Edinburgh and I'd lived in Chester, and I'd been to London, but I didn't know it in the way that you know it if you live there.
Right.
But I thought my detectives should be London-based because I wanted them to be able to go all over, the UK and investigate cases. But what's happened for me over the course of the series is that I have fallen madly in love with London. I have kind of a double life because I've got lots of friends and go over for a month at a time. And
it's a very walkable city. It's very small.
It is. I walk every day, and you can walk across central London.
Yes. And I'm sure that you've had a chance to visit and maybe dine at the Sherlock Holmes.
I am a pub connoisseur.
It's just it's so fun, isn't it, to be there in the midst of so many amazing, iconic writers and mysteries.
Well, there are blue plaques everywhere,
yes.
Which is the plaques that they put on houses that say so-and-so lived here from this date to this date. And you can be walking along the street and say, oh, my gosh, George Orwell lived there. Actually, that's Portobello Road. There's a blue plaque for George Orwell.
That's amazing.
But
That's amazing.
You're just living, history everywhere.
Do you ever have a desire to write a different kind of story or a different kind of mystery or different characters at some point? Or are you vested in Duncan and Gemma?
I'm pretty vested, but the thing about my series is that, it's multiple viewpoint. Some of the stories, and there's a lot of different settings, and some of the stories have multiple timelines. In fact, Garden of Lamentations, a really major part of the book is set back in 1994 with my undercover cop who's put into an activist group back in 1994. So, I just get to do so many different things that I haven't gotten tired of it.
Right.
And I've also brought in a couple of, it's kind of been an expanding cast and I've got more major characters now, like Melody Talbot and Doug Cullen, who have been Duncan and Gemma's professional partners now, and I love writing about them. So,
Tam and I talk about this a lot too. As writers and storytellers, you weave things together and you leave certain threads hanging, and then you can go back to that thread and pull on it and add to it, and that's part of what makes it all just so believable and credible and kind of linear. It just keeps going. Which it kind of sounds like you're doing with additional characters and all that. So you're vested in that. That's awesome. I wanted to ask what your process is, because like for our audience that is saying, hey, what are things that I need to do to be successful as a writer? What are some of the things that you do in your own life, or some of the things that you have created or that have manifested themselves in your life when it comes to you writing, your creative process?
Well, I have to admit I struggle with discipline. I know a lot of writers who are much more disciplined as far as, sticking to
like sitting at the desk for 8 hours a day, even if they have one word on the paper.
I do usually, and I usually end up doing, but I tend to kind of start slow. I do a lot of, just kind of brainstorming on paper and, working out ideas. And I'm usually thinking when, talking about the linear aspect, I'm usually thinking a book or two ahead when I'm writing. So I'm kind of planting, little seeds about things that might happen in future books, or I'm thinking about an idea I might explore, or, a relationship with the characters. I do a synopsis, and then I do what I call storyboarding. And I literally do this on paper with different colored pens or pencils. I've tried software, and nothing works as well as pen and paper, but I try to pick out maybe a half a dozen major storylines in the book, and then figure out where that storyline starts, and then where I think that storyline should end, and then what has to happen, to get that story from beginning to end. And then when I've done that for half a dozen, 6 or 8 usually, storylines, and then I start trying to kind of weave those together into a chapter scene outline, and we kind of work from there. I usually outline about chapter scene about 5 chapters at a time. I can't sit down and do it from the beginning all the way through the book because
it changes. It's fluid, exactly. And you might see something on the news, or you might talk to a friend and say, you know what, that's an interesting twist. I might want to weave that in, and so that changes it a little bit. I do the same thing. I've written several screenplays and a pilot teleplay, and I do the exact same thing of laying it out. And I love my legal pads and pencils and, writing it out. And so I can see it. You can see it, and before it's written, and then I think that's super helpful.
Well, I'm not sure what the word is, a very sort of cinematic writer anyway, and that I have always written in scenes, very distinct scenes from very distinct viewpoints. So I don't tend to do this sort of omniscient.
Now that you brought up the cinematic thing, is there any talk or possibility of this series being turned into a mini-series or a TV series or a movie?
I have always wanted to see them done for British television. And now maybe done in Britain for American television if it came to that, with Netflix and Amazon and Hulu and all the options that there are now. And the books have been optioned a couple of times for British television, and things just hasn't been quite the right fit. fingers crossed that the right thing will come along one of these days.
Well,
I would love to see that happen.
I agree with you. I think it would be amazing. Tam and I do not believe in coincidences, and timing is everything. And you can want something so badly, and if the timing is right, it's just not going to happen.
And the last option, which was a really good company, and then, the big thing in Britain turned towards historical dramas. So the timing just wasn't quite right.
We are hopeful with you that the right time is coming very soon. So
yes,
that we can see Duncan and Gemma.
Oh, that would be amazing. Casting choices and everything.
Oh, I know. I would just love it. I had actually the last option. We had casting choices and everything, and it was so much fun.
I won't ask because I don't want to put anybody, any false narrative.
No, although I discovered that it's really, really hard to put actors, well-known actors, for me in my head into my... To see them as my characters. I think what I would really like to see is actors who aren't well known, that could kind of inhabit the characters and make them their own.
I know we've whetted the appetites of writers and mystery lovers, our podcast
avid
guests.
Readers.
Yes. Where can people find you, Deborah, if they want to read more about you or find your books?
Oh, www.deborahcrombie.com. Deborah Crombie author on Facebook, and Deborah Crombie on Twitter, and Deborah Crombie on Instagram.
And then, of course, your books are everywhere that fine books are sold, right? Amazon, online,
yes, they
and
are.
all bookstores.
Also available on Audible, and I have a wonderful narrator. So,
how great is that?
Thank you. This has been so much fun.
You are welcome. I am so glad that we got a chance to talk to you, Deborah, and our audience will get to learn more about the voice behind the mystery series and Duncan and Gemma and all the characters that you create. I think we need to read more, not less.
Absolutely, absolutely. Reading is the window on the world.
We would agree. We would agree with you 100%. I mean, I read so much, and I have my favorite authors, and I read as much as I can when new books come out, and you learn so much. Like you said, it's a window to the world. It's putting you in places and environments and countries and situations that you may not ever get a chance to experience. It's truly amazing.
I feel very privileged. Thank you.
Thank you, Deborah Crombie, for sharing your True North story with us. And we'll make links to your books and your websites and your social media available on our website as well at truenorthstory.com.
Thank you.
And the world will be a better place for you and me. You just wait and see people now put up love in your heart.
Thank you for listening to True North.